Today at the National Press Club, Executive Director of Anti-Poverty Week, Toni Wren, and economic researcher Andrew Charlton consider the post-COVID economy and what's needed to alleviate further hardship for Australians. Here in Canberra at the National Press Club.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club in Canberra. I'm the club's president, Laura Tingle. Our speakers today have spent much of the pandemic drilling down into the details of how the economic shock that has accompanied it has affected people and businesses around Australia. Dr. Andrew Charlton is the Managing Director of Accenture, a consultancy which has developed tools that have given invaluable early signals about conditions on the ground during the pandemic. Toni Wren, the Executive Director of Anti-Poverty Week, has had decades of experience looking at and helping influence social welfare policies and has been diving down into local area statistics and the complexities of our social welfare system to really understand changing support. I'm really looking forward to their discussions today and on what we know as a result of that and what policy settings and actions are needed to avoid further hardship in a post-COVID economy. They've tossed a coin and Andrew Charlton will speak first. So please welcome Dr. Andrew Charlton.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, and thank you to the Press Club for the opportunity to be part of the discussion today. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the ACT and surrounding areas. And I'd also like to say what an honour it is to be on the panel with Toni Wren, someone who I admire very much and someone who has done so much to combat poverty in Australia. I want to do three things in these remarks. First, I want to talk about what we learned about poverty during the pandemic and why those lessons matter so much. Second, I want to talk about the potential long-term consequences of the pandemic for poverty, what some economists are calling economic long COVID. And third, I want to talk about what we might do about it. How will we not only build back better, but also build back fairer? So first, what did we learn about poverty during the pandemic? Well, it was just a few weeks ago that they announced the 2021 Nobel Prize in Economics. And it went to three economists, David Card, Josh Angrist, and Guido Imbens. And they got it for their work for what economists call natural experiments. So what are natural experiments and why are these worthy of the most distinguished scholarly prize in economics? Well, natural experiments are events that shake up the real world as we know it. They can be big, they can be small, but they have significant implications and they enable us to observe the consequences and learn things about the way our economies work and human nature. They are the economist's equivalent of a laboratory experiment, but they occur in the real world. The most famous natural experiment is associated with the Marielle Boatlift, which occurred in 1980. For those of you who don't know, the Marielle Boatlift was a mass emigration of Cubans who travelled from Cuba's Marielle Harbour to the United States between April and October 1980. This was a sudden and entirely unexpected event. On the 20th of April 1980, Fidel Castro, in response to a huge economic downturn and riots in the streets, announced that any Cuban that wanted to emigrate to the United States was suddenly free to do so. This led to a mass migration, and by October that year, nearly 125,000 Cubans had arrived on tiny boats, in many cases overcrowded, in Miami. Now, one of those Nobel Prize winners that I just mentioned, David Card, recognised that this was an opportunity to study an age-old and controversial question: the impact of immigrants on the wages and employment prospects of local populations. Because these Cubans, the so-called Marielitos, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, increased the labour supply in Miami, where many of them arrived, by 7%. A huge increase in the number of workers in Miami. A smaller number of them went to other cities around Florida, and of course, many cities received next to no immigrants. So David Card recognised that this was an opportunity. If they observed the subsequent employment and wages outcomes in those cities, would they be worse in the cities where there had been the most new migrants, or would they have little effect? This was a perfect natural experiment in economics to answer an incredibly important question. And he found that the extra immigrants in Miami had no negative consequences for the workers and their employment and wages in that city. So why am I telling you about the Marielitos and why am I talking about natural experiments? Because the pandemic was an incredible natural experiment that taught us a lot about economics in Australia and particularly about poverty in Australia. We did things in the pandemic that we would never ordinarily do, and the consequences of those decisions enabled us to learn things that we would never ordinarily learn. So what did we learn about poverty? Well, I've got 3 lessons that I think we should take away from this once-in-a-lifetime natural experiment. First is about unemployment benefits. This is an age-old debate. On one side, many people make the point that the unemployment benefits are very low, that they're not enough to live on. On the other side, people who don't want to increase the unemployment benefit argue that it's already enough, that the extra money may not be well spent, and that it may have negative consequences for the employment of the people who receive it. It might be a disincentive to work. And for decades, we haven't been able to resolve this debate. Well, imagine if we could have a natural experiment. Imagine if suddenly, overnight, we could have a big increase in the unemployment benefit and observe the consequences. What would happen? Would people spend it on frivolous goods and reduce their employment? Or would they pay their bills, support their families, reduce their debt? Well, we had precisely this natural experiment during the pandemic. Overnight, unemployment benefits were doubled in Australia. So what happened? Well, data from Accenture and Illion, taken with the permission from bank accounts of more than 250,000 Australians, enabled us to observe the actual spending of people who received extra money. We can see the spending of those people up to the day they received that extra money. We can see what they bought, what they spent their money on. And then after they get that increase, we can see how their spending changed. Exactly what did they do with that extra money? And the data is clear. Of that extra $550 a fortnight, the coronavirus supplement, the largest amount, $85, was spent on household bills, electricity, phone, water. $70 of that extra money was spent on food. Around $60 was spent on clothing and household goods. Around $175 was saved or used to pay down debt. What we saw is that for the people who received that extra money, it was life-changing. Hundreds of thousands of people were lifted out of poverty. They didn't spend that money on frivolous or discretionary items. They didn't withdraw from the labour market. They spent it well on their families and bills. And they spent it quickly, which made it a good stimulus that supported the economy. So the natural experiment of the pandemic enabled us to see something that we wouldn't ordinarily see. It gave us a glimpse into a debate that has been intractable for decades. Just as the Marielitos taught us the valuable lesson of the impact of immigration on employment, so the pandemic helped us answer the age-old question about the generosity of social payments. It taught us that giving more money to lower income people has many positive benefits, both to them and to the community. Experiment number 2, it was a big pandemic. Experiment number 2, workplace flexibility. Another age-old debate. Can employers trust workers with workplace flexibility? On the positive side, we know that workplace flexibility is important, that it has a strong link with poverty and social mobility. More workplace flexibility allows people with responsibilities at home to get access to a wider range of jobs. It allows them to get promotions and take on more responsibilities at the same time as spending more time with their families and dealing with other home responsibilities. But skeptics always worry that somehow if we give people workplace flexibility, it will reduce productivity. To put it bluntly, they'll be distracted. And for that reason, working from home always had a stigma. It was always seen as less good or less serious. Well, Imagine if we could have a massive natural experiment. We suddenly send home about a third of the Australian workforce and see what happened. Imagine if we could get every boss, including the dinosaur bosses, to just completely accept that everybody would have to work from home. What would we observe? Would business grind to a halt? Would productivity nosedive? Well, we had exactly this natural experiment during the pandemic. Most of Australia's white-collar workforce started working from home, and data from Accenture and Microsoft enabled us to observe how productivity responded. In many companies, productivity went up, not down. People worked smarter at home. They spent less time commuting. Productivity didn't go up for everyone. It depended on the nature of your job, the circumstances of your home office, the level of support you received. But importantly, there was no suggestion that working from home was inherently less productive. This might wipe away the stigma of flexible work. It might open the door to much more flexible work practices that give job opportunities to those who have responsibilities that prevent them from being in the workplace every day. That's experiment number 2. Experiment number 3 was massive fiscal expansion. This one's pretty close to my heart. The role of government in a recession. Again, an age-old debate. How much is too much? Most of the people in this room will remember the vicious debate in 2009 about whether Australia spent too much in the global financial crisis. Malcolm Turnbull accused Kevin Rudd of blowing the budget. The Liberal and National parties voted against the government's second stimulus bill in 2009, and our current Prime Minister referred endlessly to the Rudd government's reckless spending. Well, imagine if there was a natural experiment. What would happen if those same politicians were in a situation where they would have to spend double what the Rudd government spent? We'd be able to see what happened. Would that extra spending cost jobs or save jobs? Would it leave our economy and country stronger or weaker? Well, the pandemic delivered just such an experiment. All up, higher spending and lower revenues will cause the cost of this pandemic to be around $500 billion. JobKeeper, JobSeeker, cash flow support to small business, and many other programs worked. In previous recessions, the consequences for employment were devastating. In the 1980s recession and the 1990s recession, it took more than 2 years for employment to get back to its pre-recession level. In this time, employment bounced back hard. More than 500,000 jobs were saved. Hundreds of thousands of people were prevented from going into poverty. The pandemic natural experiment answered the age-old question about recession spending. It showed that when the state steps in, it can limit the damage to the private sector and make the country better off. So these were 3 lessons from the natural experiment of the pandemic. Higher unemployment benefits help people without hurting the economy. Flexible work can help workers without hurting businesses, and government should step in a crisis to support the private sector. The second topic I want to talk about is the long-term impacts of this crisis on poverty. Thanks to the massive government spending that I just spoke about, this was quite a strange recession. Normally in a recession, many businesses fail, many jobs are lost, poverty goes up, many families are in hardship. In this recession, thanks to government spending, financial hardship for most Australians actually went down. Nearly 500,000 people were lifted out of poverty in the middle of a recession. The barometer of the worst financial hardship in our nation, the operations of debt collectors and financial counsellors, actually had a very quiet pandemic. But 2 things should give us pause. While on average many Australians were well supported during the pandemic, some Australians did it much tougher. And these tended to be the most vulnerable Australians. Data from ACOSS shows that there is still great need in our community. By September 21, the overall number of people on income support-based payments due to unemployment is still much higher than pre-pandemic. In fact, it's 27% higher than pre-pandemic. And importantly, in the areas where this need has gone up, are the areas that were already facing financial disadvantage. The pain was not evenly spread across the community. And on top of the financial impacts, we know that there were many non-financial impacts of the crisis that affect the conditions of poverty. Mental health, personal safety, an increase in domestic violence, missed education, missed social and development experiences for young people. And the impact of these will cast a long shadow. The message is, just because the end of the pandemic may be in sight, it doesn't mean we can stop worrying about its impacts on poverty and disadvantage. So finally, what should we be doing about it? Well, we need to face into these long-term effects of the crisis on poverty. If we were smart, we'd right now be preparing a bounce-back package to help vulnerable groups get back on their feet and prevent lasting damage from the pandemic to our economy. We'd be supporting school kids, for example. Schools were closed for extended periods. We won't know the full impact of homeschooling on the generation of children for a long time, but it would be surprising if it didn't cast a long shadow over their lives, particularly for those children whose homeschooling wasn't as effective as real schooling. We don't need to settle for this. We could have a bounce-back package that supports disadvantaged kids, that makes sure they don't fall through the cracks, that helps them if they missed out on critical schooling and educational experiences. We should also be looking out for the so-called recessionals. These are the young people who are starting their working lives from a screen in their bedroom without much of the workplace training and collegiality that establishes strong career foundations, particularly for many of the young people who don't bring social capital to the workplace from their own backgrounds. Particularly for the many young people who found it hard to get a job in the crisis because many of the industries that employ young people were temporarily shut down. A bounce-back package could support the job opportunities for young people and ease their transition into employment. And finally, a bounce-back package must ensure that the people lifted out of poverty during the pandemic do not slip back into poverty once the government support ends. That would be a tragedy at the end of Australia's pandemic experience. Let me conclude by noting that as vaccine rates rise, we're worried about the effects of so-called long COVID. But we should also be worried about economic long COVID, the long-term effects, particularly on disadvantaged people, of a short-term shock. We need to act now to make sure that the progress we've made on poverty doesn't disappear. We need to learn the lessons of the crisis and take those forward boldly in our policy making. We need to make sure that the effects of mental health, missed education and employment gaps don't reappear long after the pandemic is gone. These policies aren't handouts, they are good economics that will make our economy stronger for everybody. In this case, as Toni Wren often says, the right thing to do is also the smart thing to do. Thanks very much.
Toni Wren.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Laura, for the invitation, and thank you to my lovely, charming co-presenter. I'd like to obviously, of course, acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on the lands that we're standing today as the traditional custodians of this area, the ACT and surrounding areas. I'm very pleased with this invitation and to be here actually in person, to travel from Gadigal country, to actually come out of my 5 kilometres. It's a very exciting sign of our success as a nation that as we emerge from the pandemic, we now have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. But the reason I have been asked to speak with you today is we do need to talk about poverty. I'm sure we'd all prefer not to. We'd like to focus on the joy of seeing our loved ones again, in person, not on a screen, of planning our Christmas holidays, and even, for some of us, the fun of getting back to work in the office. But we do need to talk about poverty because even before this pandemic struck, there were more than 3 million Australians who were locked in poverty. And as I'll lay out for you, I think that number, I'm a little bit more pessimistic than Andrew, will continue to rise. That's because of the consequences of the pandemic and our inadequate policy responses to it. Again, before we started this pandemic, we already had severe wealth inequality in Australia. And in fact, the ACOSS UNSW report that was released last year, but the data was a bit old, showed us that before we had the pandemic, the highest 20% of Australians had 6 times the wealth of the middle, but 90 times the wealth of the lowest 20%, 90. And that's increasing over time. So wealth inequality in Australia is getting worse. And that just doesn't feel right in one of the wealthiest countries of the world, and one that we pride ourselves as being a country that gives everyone a fair go. But for the Australians living in poverty, and we may not see them, they're not always that obvious, but they're in every town, every city and every region, the lockdown for them has not ended. It grinds on. Not having enough money to cover the basics, including your housing, restricts daily life and crushes hope for the future. It's like living in a permanent lockdown. Andrew has outlined who was most affected, but one of the stark figures is really the death rate. I mean, compared to many nations, we got off lightly, but the Institute of Health and Welfare put out the death rate stats for part of the pandemic, and it was 4 times. People on the lowest income died at a rate 4 times that of higher income people. And they caught COVID at a higher rate as well. I'm not going to further go into the policy decisions that were taken, but I do want to talk about the one that I think is going to have the biggest consequence on us, and that's what we didn't do. We failed to secure the vaccines, procure them in 2020, and we failed to get the rollout done fast enough by the first quarter of 2021. Those large-scale lockdowns that many of us, half the country, more than half the country, have had to go through were totally avoidable. The harm done by our failure to even be in the race, let alone win the race, the harm done for business, for communities, individuals, families and governments at all levels is going to flow through for many years to come. So today I want to discuss just 3 of the reasons I think that we will see increased poverty as we come out of this pandemic. But I also want to acknowledge that for many Indigenous communities, our First Nations communities in the Northern Territory today, they're still dealing with the crisis of the pandemic. It's not over, it's still ongoing. So the first of these is the housing affordability crisis. So we've had a failure to invest in social housing over decades, and increased house prices have been driving those 2 things, a big increase in reliance on private rental. The pandemic, despite many predictions, actually has supercharged these factors. Prices are going up whether you're buying or renting. In the year to June, regional rents across Australia went up by 11%. And in some parts of coastal Queensland, it was 30%. My colleague Kate Colvin, fantastic woman who speaks for the Everybody's Home campaign, continues to do this data, and yesterday she sent me the data for October, up until October this year. So we still saw 30% increases in the Sunshine Coast, the Gold Coast, but also in places that weren't affected as much by lockdowns. In WA, some 27% increases, 21% in Far North Queensland, Sydney, 15%. Melbourne's the outlier, only 3%. But those percentages translate into higher rents that people simply can't afford to pay. Commonwealth rent assistance, which is what you get if you're a low-income family or on a social security payment, hasn't had a real increase since 2000. That's 21 years. The tax package, that's when the real increase happened. And so many people are about $200 a week. There's a gap from what they get in the rent assistance and what they're actually paying. And my colleague who's here today, Casey Chambers from Anglicare Australia, every year put out the rental affordability snapshot. And yes, we saw an improvement last year when the coronavirus supplement was paid, but this year again, the number of properties that were available to rent was minuscule for someone on a social security payment. So having secure housing is a basic human right and something we should all expect. But for far too many people right now, of all ages, that's really beyond their grasp. But the other alarming prospect is something that many of us have been concerned about for some time, which is the phenomena of retirement poverty. We in Australia have been cushioned really by a decent age pension level, but also predominantly most people who retire in Australia up until now have owned their own home. So that's the cushioning effect of poverty in retirement. As we see this rental crisis and buying crisis go forward, we would expect to see many more people retiring without owning their own home. And it's very pleasing to see that the Treasury own review of retirement income, and even this week the RBA has also called out this problem that we would expect to see in the future. So in addition to this housing affordability crisis we're dealing with, we're also seeing the number of people who need unemployment payments is going to rise. As Andrew said, it's about 27% more now than before we had the bushfires and the pandemic. But we've also got 2 million people who have this year, for this lockdown, these avoidable lockdowns, have needed to claim another payment called COVID disaster payment. That's gone. 2 million Australians have needed that. That payment, we still don't know how many of them, but I don't think all 2 million of them are going to be able to automatically snap back to their jobs or find a new job. So a proportion of those are also going to have to go on JobSeeker. JobSeeker, even with the welcome permanent increase in April, is still only $45 a day and $36 a day if you're a younger person. That's well below the poverty line, $65 a day. It's $165 a week below the age pension, which nobody thinks is too generous. So there's over 1 million people receiving those payments, and for every single one of them, they're living in poverty. But I think that we're going to see from the pandemic, these JobSeeker numbers rise. Because JobSeeker, despite its name, is actually a catch-all for a whole lot of other things that are happening in our community. If you're sick, including if you're having cancer treatment, there's no sickness benefit in Australia. You're on JobSeeker. And we'll expect to see an increase in illnesses flowing from the pandemic. We know already there are 145,000 fewer mammograms conducted by Breast Screen Australia in the first 6 months of 2020 because of the pandemic. So those screenings that saved many lives, and I'm one of them, did not happen. So we will expect to see more people with those illnesses coming through the system, and some will need JobSeeker. People who have a disability or an impairment increasingly now have to also go on JobSeeker. I've been shocked as a former welfare rights advocate to hear now that you actually need legal representation to get that payment in Australia. It's so hard to get. So around 34% of people on JobSeeker now actually have a disability or an impairment. We've also got a lot of older women and men who've been laid off later in their working lives, and frankly they're just waiting to claim the higher age pension. And of course we've got single parents, predominantly mothers, because as we know, poverty is gendered like violence in this country, with children over the age, with a child over the age of 8 years. There's no parenting payment for those mothers, those families. It's JobSeeker. So the third issue that I want to discuss is the increasing relationship breakdown that we will see that I believe will fuel further poverty. Like the other two factors, domestic violence was already way too high before this pandemic struck. But it's been exacerbated by financial pressures and, frankly, because lockdowns are a perfect excuse to compound coercive controlling behaviours. Alcohol consumption went up 20%, according to the Institute of Health and Welfare. Another factor. Perpetrators and victims were under pressure, living together under the same roof for close to 24 hours a day. And we know the data showed us from the 2020 lockdowns that the severity and prevalence increased. And we expect, unfortunately, again, the 2021 lockdowns to show that this human tragedy will only be compounded. But even without violence or coercive control, millions of families have been under extreme pressure, coping with lockdowns, juggling homeschooling with working from home, the double burden for many women, homeschooling for those who don't have an adequate device or data, internet data, really difficult, the increasing mental health presentation of children, financial concerns, and the loss of normal supports like being able to see your grandparents, your friends, go out and kick a footy around with your mates. These pressures will play out, I believe, in an increased number of relationship breakdowns and the emergence of new single parent, again, mainly female-headed families. These families are at high risk of poverty and homelessness simply because of the inadequacies of our policy responses. And yes, my colleagues at the front line of emergency relief are seeing the numbers come through already. The lockdowns may have ended, but like in a natural disaster, the impact goes on, and many people only emerge and ask for help after that. So if we put all these things together, these three factors, the question that I want to ask you is, who does it harm? And my answer is our children. Prior to this pandemic, it was a source of shame that 1 in 6 Australian children were growing up in poverty. That's an average of 5 in a classroom of 30. Today, I will put out there that I think it's now 1 in 5. This includes the estimates we've done that there are at least 940,000 children living in families on those lowest social security payments. And it correlates with the shocking figures that our colleagues at Food Bank released in Anti-Poverty Week this year, that more than 1.2 million children went hungry in Australia during the last year. Our housing policies don't ensure they're protected from living in a car, from sharing accommodation with extended family members or friends, or moving regularly, losing friends and changing schools. Our broken child support scheme, which I was at the birth of in 1988 and I was very proud of, that it was a bipartisan program, it's broken now, and it doesn't ensure that those children have as close as possible the standard of living they would have had before the relationship ended, which was always the goal of that program. 50% of domestic violence survivors have children. Poverty and homelessness should not be the price that they and their mothers pay for leaving violence. What are we going to do about it? I put it to you that our child poverty rate, rather than a source of shame, could be a source of pride for how well we are doing as a nation. We have the solutions. The coronavirus supplement that Andrew referred to protected millions from poverty, and it halved poverty for single-parent families, the poorest families. This year we campaigned with our colleagues at ACOSS and the Everybody's Home campaign for a raise of income support to at least the poverty line, a 50% increase in Commonwealth rent assistance, and a serious investment in social housing for both federal and state territory governments. We hear a lot about that the best form of welfare is a job. We're probably going to hear it quite a bit in the next few months leading up to an election. But I contend the best form of welfare is one that helps you to get a job, doesn't lock you out of the labour market because you can't afford to feed yourself or secure a safe home. The best form of welfare protects you from poverty when you get ill, when you acquire a disability, when you lose your job, or you go through a relationship breakdown. And that's about 70% of us over a 10-year period that need that welfare support. The best form of welfare invests early to save higher costs down the track. I think we as a nation deserve the best form of welfare. We've got the evidence to design it, we've got the wealth to pay for it. We just need to demand it from all our political representatives. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for really interesting observations about what's happened and what we have to do next. Andrew, you've talked about a bounce back package, which is looking at particular groups like school kids and the recessionists, which is a term I really like. And you've talked about some of the priorities of things. But if we go back to basics, first of all, for the audience, can we just define what poverty is now? And also, from both of you, what would be the single most important thing to do right now if you were trying to sort of alleviate the number of new people going into poverty and bringing people out of it?
Okay. So the commonly used definition in Australia is 50% of median income. And so in Australia, for a single person, that's about $457 a week, and it's larger for different family size groups. It's not accepted by our government. Our government doesn't want to talk about poverty. In fact, they want to have an argument about how we define it. But we know that even the work that they fund at the University of Melbourne every year says it doesn't matter whether you use that definition or a relative deprivation index. There's a couple of other academic measures. The groups that are most concerned, that they're most concerned about, are the single parent families. And yes, our income support system, particularly for people who are unemployed, it's just too low. So
what are the income levels like, just to reiterate the points you were making about how they compare with that $457 a week?
Yes, so as I said, job seekers about $45 a day, but if you're younger, it's $36 a day, and the poverty line is $65 a day. So it's well below the poverty line.
And that difference has been getting worse over the decades. People who are living on those unemployment benefits and associated payments have been falling further below the poverty line as every year increases. The simple answer to your question, Laura, what could you do, is we just saw what you can do. If you raise the unemployment benefit and associated benefits, you will lift an enormous number of people out of poverty. That happened with the coronavirus supplement. And what we risk now is pushing those people back into poverty. There are, of course, so many factors that contribute to poverty. There's no one single solution, but that single policy made the biggest difference we've ever made to policy, and it's a shame to let it go.
And we saw it with the age pension when that was increased by $30 a week. And again, why we don't have that retirement poverty, age pension poverty, because that was done under the previous Labor government.
So the sort of the great quandary in all of this is, as you've said, Andrew, we've had these big experiments and there were really big positives out of it. But why is it that we still are in this position where one of the first things everybody wanted to stop was the doubling of the coronavirus supplement, which is effectively the doubling of unemployment benefits. What is the break point of our political debate, that this is still sort of seen as some sort of measure of fiscal discipline, whereas JobKeeper, just saying, is dismissed, even though there's billions of dollars that have been sprayed around unnecessarily? Why do you think that is?
It's very hard to answer that question. As you say, when you compare the largesse of JobKeeper with the speed to cut down the unemployment benefits, to eliminate the coronavirus supplement, and you think about the need of those people who received that supplement, it's very hard to understand why that wouldn't be a big priority. particularly at a time when there's still a lot of need in the community, a lot of vulnerable groups still living with the long-term effects of the crisis. It feels like something which both made good economic sense and was the right thing to do for those individuals. So I hope that we get to the situation where we can recognise that lesson of the pandemic, take some of that data and use it to inform better, more generous and ultimately more effective welfare policies going forward.
And I mean, I would say that our political parties, our major political parties both, think that there's no votes in it. They think that Australians don't care about poverty and so they shouldn't make it a priority. I disagree. I think Australians do care about poverty, and we've got evidence to show that from polling. But both political parties feel they need to run away from it, and the increase we got, which was the first since 1994, was considered by the government as the minimum, or the maximum that people would cop, even though it was such a small amount.
Next question is from Andrew Charlton.
Andrew Charlton from the Financial Review and director here at the Press Club. Probably a question directed more for Andrew. And you talked about COVID sort of being a great big experiment. I think the whole thing has been a fabulous scientific experiment as well, sort of thing, in terms of how we manage future pandemics and what works and what doesn't. But putting that aside, you sort of talked about what worked from an Australian point of view in terms of the economics things, the supports that were put in place and things like that. What about globally, what we saw other countries do? Have you researched that? Is there any particular countries which you think will come out perhaps better ahead, and what have they done, and what lessons we could apply from that to an Australian context?
Yeah, great question. And one of the wonderful things about this natural experiment is that it occurred globally. So you can see what an individual country did and compare it to what another country did and see what worked best. We are starting to get really good data on the economic outcomes in lots of different countries, and there are some very obvious lessons that everybody here will be familiar with, that those countries that were most successful in dealing with the health pandemic were also more successful economically. There was no evidence of the trade-off that we learned about at the beginning of the pandemic being a real thing. Some of the economic lessons, I think, that you take away from the cross-country data is that speed was incredibly important. New Zealand lost a lot fewer jobs than Australia because they implemented their wage subsidy program, their equivalent of JobKeeper, earlier. Almost all, in fact, the majority of the jobs that Australia lost, we lost before the introduction of JobKeeper, in those critical few weeks before we introduced it. So speed was a massive factor. The second factor was coverage. The JobKeeper program did miss out some groups of people. In particular, and unfortunately, it missed out some of the most vulnerable groups of people. Casual short-term workers, people who have relatively low attachment to the labour market. And those people bore the brunt of the job losses. They were the easiest to let go of, and they weren't recipients of government support. In countries that didn't do that, they had much lower losses of that category of worker. So there's an enormous amount of data coming in from different countries, and we have different policies in different countries to compare. And hopefully that informs us and makes us better prepared, more knowledgeable, and more ready for the next crisis that comes along.
Thank you.
Could I just ask, in terms of different policy responses, we obviously had the sort of the JobKeeper package, and then subsequently the emergency payments packages, and it strikes me that in this sort of second phase, because it wasn't a universal scheme, it became much harder and became much more disaggregated, trying to get some sort of sense about what was going on in communities, in businesses and the like. Did the experience of people in poverty, I mean, obviously payments were lower, but how did the experience differ, if you like, in that second phase of support to how it played out the first time round?
Well, I guess the big thing is that in 2021, people who are on the lowest payments got nothing extra, except a couple of $100,000 got $200 a week if they'd lost part-time work after quite a bit of advocacy. But we know around 25% of people, so about 250,000 people who are on unemployment payments at any time have part-time work, and they still had that before these lockdowns. But a very small number overall got access to that top-up. Everybody else got nothing. So that's why I'm saying poverty is increasing. And yeah, we saw again that we're waiting to see, as I said, what happens with the disaster payment turning off. There was very little data for us to see. There were over 1 million people in New South Wales who needed that payment, but we didn't get any granular detail at all, unfortunately. So there were a tale of two lockdowns and two responses very much. And yeah, just so that everybody's aware, the JobKeeper payment cost us $90 billion. The coronavirus supplement cost us $19 billion. I know where I'd put my money.
Peter Martin.
Peter Martin, The Conversation. A question to both of you. You talked about natural experiments, Andrew, and you talked about the, I've got to get this right, Marielle Boatlift. I know the one, anyway. And what the study you talked about found is that big increase in immigration, very little deleterious effects. We've just had a natural experiment on immigration. We've turned it off. And what we've found is that job vacancies are going through the roof, unprecedented. We've found that there's more ability for people to change than ever before. And just today, we've seen a further upward increase in wage rises. Now, what do you say to people? And the weight of Australian evidence, you know, is also clear that immigration tends not to hurt people. But what do you say to Australian people who've just seen the result of this natural experiment and who are saying, gosh, gee, we better not go back to how it was before?
Yeah, look, I hope that's not the lesson that people take about the immigration. And there are two reasons. I acknowledge your point that we have just had a period in which we turned off immigration, and that period was coincident with a really strong bounce back in employment and wage outcomes. I don't think that breaks the David Card argument for two reasons. First of all, you have to distinguish between the short term and the long term. And the long term impacts of having strong immigration are contributions to the economy, greater demand, creating more jobs. So there's a big difference between a short-term frictions in some industries like hospitality or fruit picking or other areas where obviously if you turn off the main source of supply to those industries, you're going to get a short-term reaction. And the long-term effect, which includes the benefits that those immigrants bring
harder for people to see, though,
to the community. Sure, but I think that difference is important. And the second thing is that, you know, right now, part of the reason why we're getting such strong bounce back and such a tight labour market is also the enormous stimulus in the economy. I mean, add it up. You got record low interest rates, record high government money into the economy, lots of cash handouts still flowing through, pent-up savings from people who were unable to spend. So there's a big demand side piece there as well that's contributing to that labour market tightness. I think when you add those two things up, the impact of the policy stimulus plus the long term, we'll find that it will still be true that immigrants are a positive force in the Australian economy. They make us all a stronger and wealthier nation.
Nick Stewart.
G'day, Andrew. I think you've had the headline already. You've seized the headline with the fact that the Reserve Bank has actually caught up with the fact that housing prices have risen. And that will come as a shock, no doubt, to many. I'd like to follow up Peter Martin's question because I don't think that's an answer. I think what you've given us is 3 reasons why you're right, but no reasons, no further self-reflection. I mean, when you look at immigration, for example, no one doubts that we need to get a vibrant economy, and that will be increased by having other people from other countries coming. That's a definite, that's a no-brainer. But you haven't really, you've picked some things. What you haven't, for example, given is a reason why we've had release of monetary policy, but on the other hand, we also have incredible now gaps between the wealthy and the poor. Yet this has increased over this period as well. How can that be the case without some other forms? And also, Toni, I was wondering, isn't what you're really talking about a housing first policy? Isn't it important to give people the security to allow them then to go forward into the economy rather than worrying about particular packages that will assist them for, you know, whether it's coronavirus or other periods, job seeking, whatever? Don't we really need to think of housing as the biggest problem?
Do you want to take housing first?
Yeah, I'll take housing. Definitely, it's a huge problem, and housing first would be wonderful. There's just so much to catch up on. I think we had one of our colleagues did some work that said even if all the state money that's been promised on public housing, social housing, actually happened and all those houses were built, we'd be still so far behind. Because it's simply just been years and years of underinvestment. So I don't see, yes, we need to do more definitely in that space, and it is absolutely a Commonwealth responsibility, despite the fact they keep saying it's not. And then on the rent side, it's difficult because, if we do give more rent assistance, will that just drive up prices again? There's a lot more that needs to be done in the housing space, and I don't see anybody's willing to tackle it because for too many people, housing is a source of wealth. So I think we need to do both. We do need to give people cash in their hands to pay for the basics, and we do need to tackle housing affordability.
And I just agree with you mainly. We do need to worry about the distributional consequences of immigration. But I think the answer to that comes down to making sure that we have a good mix in our immigration policy, that we provide support to people coming in, that we have the right infrastructure, including social infrastructure and economic infrastructure and good job opportunities in the parts of the nation where incoming migrants tend to be concentrated. I think if we do that, we can do a lot to solving some of those distributional consequences, which I don't think are a necessary outcome of higher immigration, but are an outcome of poorly managed immigration.
Just on that distributional question, I mean, there's been a lot of focus in Sydney on the difference between the east and the west in the way lockdowns played out and disease played out. Do you think we also, and I suppose it goes to the point about inequality, I mean, this is another, grand experiment, isn't it? Because we have seen so starkly the distributional impact on different workforces, different income levels in different geographic locations, and not a lot of tolerance or sort of response from government to say, actually, we need to actually help some communities more than others?
I thought the geographic divide in the second Sydney lockdown was a staggering policy failure. Between the cities east and west, there were just huge consequences driven by a number of factors. First of all, the lockdown was much harder in Sydney's west. Secondly, the consequences of that lockdown were much more severe because it's more likely in Sydney's west to be unable to continue to work from home. The number of people who are in that 30% of jobs that enables people to work from home is lower. Then third, the level of government support wasn't as high in the city's west as it was in the city's east, partly because of the barriers in accessing that money. Those barriers included language barriers, complexity in the application process, challenges in getting that money into the informal sector, which is much larger in the city's west. So we had a situation where we had much more severe consequences and much less help. And we saw that in the numbers. The retail trade was hit much worse, small businesses were hit much worse, and individuals had a much tougher time. And I think the blindness to that geographic divide was a really unfortunate outcome in that second Sydney lockdown.
Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Laura. Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club. By 1990, no Australian child should be living in poverty, and that was an important statement made at the time by Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Can we just fast forward to 2021? We're here now. Toni, a 9-year closed the gap on preventing more children and women particularly entering that poverty spiral. How could we get there? We're having and struggling with closing the gap in our Indigenous endeavours. And Andrew, it shocked me when you told us those figures about electricity bills, water and phone, $85 out of those emergency payments going to pay down those bills. A lot of those businesses foreign owned. In a utopian housing environment for the future, do we use technology, renewable energies, NBN and all that social welfare housing? Is that a step towards closing that gap, say, by 2030? Toni.
Thanks so much. Yeah, they actually reduced poverty by 30%. They didn't eliminate it, but those commitments did actually reduce child poverty, and it's possibly the last time we've heard the words and the aspiration. So I would say well done. And it's absolutely the key thing. One of the key things was the family assistance supplement package that went so that whether or not you were a low-income working family or on welfare benefits, you got the same amount for your kids. That's now been eroded, and that's certainly an area ripe for policy reform to increase those family payments, particularly at those that lower end, and so that there's no question that people can move, because we know people do move between the two. So that would be a key area. And the other one is the one I mentioned earlier, the child support. That was a very big initiative as part of that commitment. And sadly, we're pretty well at the same place we were in 1988 because it was eroded again by other forces that decided that those policies were too harsh for the payment on the non-custodial parent. But in effect, it means that the women and children are left with at least 1.6 billion is owed in child support debt. That's a very small proportion of what's owed. There's so much we could do, and that means that individual families are coming out of poverty, but it also saves government money.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yeah, Tim, thank you for raising the role of technology in combating disadvantage. I think technology gets a really bad name, and often people accuse it of exacerbating inequality and disadvantage, and I think many of those fears are well justified. But I wish we spent as much time thinking about the potential of technology to help us combat disadvantage. We've been talking about policy solutions here, and many of the policy solutions are good solutions, but they're old solutions. How do we try and identify new policy tools, increase our armoury to tackle these problems? And I think that's where there's a huge agenda to have technology help us in this regard. Even in this pandemic, think about how technology has helped. Pinpointing and being able to target where we have low vaccination rates, identifying which businesses are really struggling, which communities are doing it toughest. I think technology has the power, if we use it well, to help identify disadvantage much earlier than we've ever been able to detect it, at a much more granular level than we've ever been able to detect it. And that means we can create interventions that promote social justice in almost every category, in health, in education, in business and commerce. We should be able to use technology to identify where the problems are, see more quickly and more clearly where people are falling through the gaps, and target policy responses to help them. There's a huge agenda there in using technology to combat disadvantage, and I wish we talked a lot more about that.
Thank you.
Mr. Schubert.
Misha Schubert as the Vice President of the National Press Club. Thank you both for such a clear and cogent exposition of some of the issues we've just lived through in social and economic policy. I've often thought that one of the big challenges in both social and economic policy is the ability to model the counterfactual. So when governments are sitting there with a finite set of resources and choices before them, they're looking at the immediate short-term outlays, and it's harder to sit that up against the longer-term savings that could come from lifting more people out of poverty. What clever work is already out there or could and should be done to help make those decisions, to bring all that data together when governments are making decisions about these things?
Issue very close to my heart, Misha. I think this is the power of the natural experiments plus the better data that we now have to be able to identify, okay, when we look at a particular policy intervention and it was implemented in this natural experiment way, which creates that counterfactual. It was implemented in one state but not another. Implemented for one group of people but not another. Implemented in Australia but not New Zealand. How do we use those natural experiments to identify that counterfactual and therefore observe the effectiveness of any one of those policy measures? I think we have decades of scholarship provided to us on a platter from the natural experiments in the pandemic, and lots of them go to those types of questions. And our ability to use better data, new natural experiments to create more policy evidence is hugely exciting. And we can only hope and wish and encourage our governments and our bureaucrats to do more evidence-based policy making, because there's never been a better time to do evidence-based policy making, because we've never had so much evidence and so much data. So it'll be awesome to start using it.
He's still so optimistic. I love it. Some of us have been around a bit longer and we've looked at the evidence and we've presented the evidence. And I to speak to your point really about children and investing in children, we've got hugely fantastic evidence of programs that have happened on the ground and of data that shows if we invest in children, especially in the early years, the payoff is huge. And the counterfactual, if we don't invest, the cost both to those children and their lives, but to us as a nation, is far greater. We know that. We all know that. It's about having the political will to make those decisions, to say we're going to do that and we're not going to. We know that children who grow up in poverty are 3 times more likely to live in poverty as an adult because they haven't finished school, they've got more issues with, not all of them haven't finished school, but their education is lower, their health outcomes, both physical and mental, are lower, their social connections. There's just a myriad of data that shows there is absolutely nothing, there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing this. And we are the wealthiest country in the world on some measures. So if not us, who?
Our last question is from Oliver Primrose.
Hi. So my question for you both is, with the lacklustre wage growth that we've seen in the past few decades, combined with the house prices continuing to increase and the economic impact of COVID, what does the Australian dream of home ownership look like for young Australians, let alone young Australians experiencing poverty?
Well, the promise of home ownership is getting more and more out of reach for young Australians. And the tragedy of that is that it's at least partly by design. We have a series of policies that pump up the value of house prices for incumbent owners. You could, on almost every measure, the tax system, the pension system, they are all making the problem worse rather than better. Of course, this is a terrible political problem because lots of voters own homes, but the truth is we have run ourselves into this cul-de-sac. It's been exacerbated by a secular decline in interest rates, but the policy issues are severe. And the Labor Party went to the last election with some policies which would have made a difference. I'm not saying they would have changed the world on this question, but they would have made a difference. And the conventional wisdom about those policies is that they were not supported by the electorate. I never know whether these conventional wisdoms are right or not, but that's certainly the message that we seem to have taken away. So we've made an active or at least tacit decision as a nation to ignore this problem and make it worse. And Toni spoke about the centrality of housing in poverty, and she's absolutely right. And almost everything we're doing from a policy perspective is exacerbating that problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Toni Wren and Andrew Charlton.